Before we begin, we want to acknowledge that some stories and discussions in this episode of Radiant Resilience may touch on sensitive and potentially triggering topics. These may include themes of eating disorders, alcohol abuse, sexual shame and purity culture, herpes diagnosis and stigma, mental health struggles and anxiety, psychedelic use. Our goal is to share real-life experiences in a respectful and empathetic manner, offering insights into the complexities of the human spirit and the journey towards resilience. However, we understand that some content might be difficult for listeners. We encourage you to prioritize your well-being and discretion when deciding to listen. Please remember this podcast is not a substitute for professional advice or support. If you find yourself needing assistance, we urge you to seek help from qualified professionals or trusted support systems. Your mental and emotional health is important to us. Thank you for your courage and for joining us in a space of understanding and compassion. Welcome back, everyone, to Radiant Resilience. I am really excited about this unique conversation that we are going to be having today. I have with me Leslie Draffin. She helps midlife women embrace their bodies, sex, and psychedelics so they can overcome the wound of unworthiness, get free from mental health challenges, and build a life they're excited about. Leslie believes somatic practices like breath work, along with sacred earth medicine, have the power to bring us home to ourselves, awaken our authenticity, and heal the trauma locked within our subconscious. Hi, Leslie. How are you today?
Hi, Tawny. I am great. Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, thanks for coming on. This is super exciting for me. I dabbled a little bit in some microdosing of mushrooms, which I haven't told many people, so that's coming out of me. But I dabbled myself just for my own depression and struggles that I've had. And so I'm really interested to hear somebody who's a little bit more of an expert on it talk about it. But why don't you start a little bit with what led you into this journey and how you even started microdosing yourself?
For sure. So, I come from a career in TV. I was a news anchor for 15 years, and I found myself on this journey of being a guide and a coach because of my own healing. So,
Mhm.
I came to this work because I spent at least 20 years deeply numbing out and punishing myself
Mm.
through things like eating disorders and alcohol
Mhm.
abuse because I had this deep wound of unworthiness that I know I had since I was probably an infant, but it was really made worse because when I was 18, I got diagnosed with herpes about a month after I first had
Mhm.
sex. And I'm a preacher's daughter from the deep south of the United States. So that sunk
Oh,
me into
wow.
a deep shame spiral. Yeah, a big shame spiral where I just felt worthy, I felt dirty. And so, in addition to these physical ways of punishing myself through starving or making myself throw up or
Mm.
getting really wasted, I also got addicted to hustling and achieving and trying to prove to everybody that I was worthy of love. And what was
Mm.
interesting is that's a way that society really reveres us. When we are successful, society loves that. And I was really good at that. And
Mm.
so, throughout my entire 20s and early 30s, from the outside looking in, society would have said I had it all together. And yet, internally, I was deeply anxious. I was depressed. I had multiple issues around burnout. And I was really coping with these negative mechanisms that were making things just worse and worse. And I went to therapy. I got prescribed medications and came on and off those for a couple of years. Didn't like the side effects, didn't like the fact that I would go to therapy and feel like I was just talking to a peer, like a friend. Like they would often say things to me like, "Wow, you're so good at talking about your trauma." I'm like, "Why do I feel like shit still?" And I found more of the spiritual mindfulness modalities. I think that's when things started to click for me. In 2019, I really had this spiritual awakening. I found embodiment practices and breath work. And in 2022, early 2022, that is when I started to experiment with intentional psychedelic microdosing.
Okay.
I worked with a guide And initially it was to overcome that sexual shame. But what
Mhm.
it ended up giving me was my mental health back, the ability to really look deeply at what that wound of unworthiness had done to me, and eventually also helped me get sober. And so that's how I got here and how I became this person who now I look at myself as someone who helps the women who are like me, a few steps behind me, move forward in a way that feels empowering to them.
So your vices were mostly, you said it was the eating disorder and alcohol?
Oh, yeah, I know for sure.
Oh, oh man. And so you didn't do any type of rehab or anything like that then necessarily. It was just jumping into the microdosing.
Yeah, so I had tried to quit alcohol since 2020. And I would go through these periods of what I would call sober curiosity. I read a book called Sober Curious by Ruby Warrington in I think April of 2020. That's also when I had gotten married and it was the height of lockdown, so we had
Yeah.
to we had to, cancel our wedding and all
Mm.
of this stuff, but we still got married. And I realized when I went back to work after that long weekend, because I didn't really take that much time off, because why would I was so drunk that whole weekend that I really didn't remember a lot of it. And I'm like, that's really not okay. So I read this book and then took several months off of drinking. But each year I would have these extended breaks from alcohol, but they always had an end date. There was always this like place in the back of
Mm.
my mind where it's like, oh, when I get to 2 months, I'll have a drink. When I get to 100 days, I'll have a drink. And it wasn't until I really started to notice and pick apart why I was drinking and what I was
Mhm.
trying to avoid that I think I finally found sobriety. Because I
Mm.
think it was the inner work for me that allowed me to get rid of that coping mechanism. And I think that it was the power of the mushrooms to rewire my brain and my taste buds so that after I'd spent a year without alcohol and I tried to drink again, it tasted terrible. I guess we're done.
Yeah. That's so interesting because I think a lot of people do that with alcohol. I think it's an off and on, and it's socially accepted compared to all other drugs and stuff like that. And that's what we do when every social situation
Everything.
includes alcohol. And it's so interesting to me because I have recently been seeing how much alcohol wrecks people's lives so much more, I think, than other drugs that are out there. And yet it's legal and very socially accepted, and everyone's doing it. And so it's easy to rationalize in your mind, this is fine. I'm just having a drink every day after work. That's what everybody else does. It's fine.
Yeah. And for me, in my late 20s, it was definitely a problem. It was like a
Mm,
browned out situation to a blackout situation. I was drinking
mm,
every single day. And I remember having to like graduate from like the normal bottle of wine to the 1.5 liter bottle of wine to the box of wine, just so I didn't have to keep going back and forth to the liquor store. And also because I was cheap. So it was like, how can I make this more affordable?
yeah.
But the other thing that I think really shifted it for me, and especially in 2020, the reason why becoming sober seemed so like juicy and so necessary was because of how deeply it was impacting my anxiety. In the
Hmm.
pandemic, I was the essential anchor. So if we remember all those years ago when you would see TV news anchors from their home, that was never me.
Oh,
I was
yeah.
never the one who was allowed to just sit my ass at home. I was the one who was at the station. So I was working more hours. I was taking those phone calls from terrified people, usually older
Mm.
people who lived alone. And my anxiety was through the roof. And in Ruby's book, she really does talk about why alcohol is really tricky for anxiety, especially when you wake up in the middle of the night with that anxiety. If you're someone who wakes up at 3 or 4 in the morning and you have those ruminating thoughts and you had
That's
had
me.
alcohol the night before, probably the alcohol, because
Yeah.
it's something that we think is going to put us to sleep, but it won't keep us
Yeah.
asleep. And then it really does trigger those thoughts of anxiety where I would notice that even with one glass, after I'd take a lot of time off from drinking, when I came back and had just one glass of wine, guaranteed I was going to wake up at 3 o'clock that next morning,
Mm,
worried about whatever, anything and nothing.
interesting.
So
Yeah.
that was the biggest catalyst for me. I had tapered down my alcohol when I entered into my 30s for a variety of reasons, health, changing jobs, wasn't really in a party city anymore. I was in a sturdy and steady relationship, but it was that anxiety. that I
Mhm.
think for me was really the biggest catalyst to start experimenting back in 2020 with sobriety.
I think it's interesting too because I think we have those anxious moments and that anxiety, and then we drink more
Yeah.
because you're like, oh my God, it's going to calm me down. I need to have more alcohol. And then that ends up in getting into a scary spiral of just continuing to try to numb and numb. Because as soon as you come out of it, I know even the few times that I do have a girls' night out or something like that, I'm like the next day, everything's bothering me. Everything makes me feel worse. And I overthink everything.
Yeah. Anxiety.
So yeah, yeah, it
Hangover with
definitely makes
anxiety.
it worse for
Yeah.
sure. Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about your eating disorder? Hi, friend, and welcome to this episode of Radiant Resilience. We are always looking for new guests on the podcast. I want to highlight you if you have a story of resilience that inspires others. Everyone has a story, and I believe that sharing yours can help others feel less alone. Are you ready to share your journey and inspire others? I want to hear from you. Every story has the power to impact lives and foster a supportive community. If you have a tale of overcoming adversity, personal growth, or a unique perspective on life's challenges, I would love to have you as a guest on the podcast. To become a guest, please email us directly at radiantresiliencepodcast@gmail.com or click the link in the show notes to become a guest. Join us in spreading hope, strength, and inspiration one story at a time. Be brave and share your story so others feel less alone. I hope to see you soon.
Sure. Yeah. So I remember my eating disorder starting right around the age of 15.
Mhm.
Now I know it probably was linked to a combination of things, but including 9/11.
Oh.
So I wasn't like I lived close to New York, but I remember the feeling of unsteadiness that was just very prevalent. And that I think deeply rocked me. I was also a sophomore in high school. I had a brand new schedule with zero of my friends.
Mhm.
And I was in I had a boyfriend for the first time. And I do think that all of those things triggered a couple of issues within me, including my unworthiness, including scarcity, including feelings of instability. And so I did what I knew to do, which is try to control. And so I would have these games I'd play with myself. How long could I go without eating?
Oh, wow.
So I,
Intentionally in your mind.
uh huh, yeah, yeah.
Okay.
Or how little could I eat? And the interesting thing, I was talking to someone, I was actually talking to my doctor the other day about this long history that I'd had. And she was like, why didn't anybody notice? I was like, probably because I had really good muscle tone and I was an athlete. So I
Mhm.
was never like the picture that you see of anorexia where it was just like a skeleton. I was very thin, but I was also still very active. And so that really remained throughout my teens, early 20s. It morphed into when I would eat or I'd feel too full
Mhm.
immediately I was going to go throw up and purge.
Oh, wow.
And what's interesting is in the world of podcasting, I always like to say this for folks who are listening. We talk sometimes weeks before these air. And so we're talking the week of Thanksgiving.
Yes.
Thanksgiving has and will probably always be my biggest trigger day, both for the eating
Oh.
disorder and for alcohol. And so I did some therapy around the eating disorder. I did some therapy, and alcohol would come up in the therapy too. But in my late 20s, the eating disorder morphed into an obsession with macro counting. So I was allowing myself to eat, but I was being so studious and obsessed with like how much protein I ate and how many carbs and how much fat. And so finally, in 2021, I said, this is enough's enough. I can't do it anymore. I don't want to be 80 years old, living in a nursing home, worried about how many calories are in the pudding cup. That's for dessert.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
like, I have to figure something out. And that kind of started my deep dive into what diet culture looks like, why we very much as women are
Mhm.
stuck in diet culture, and pinpointing in my life where I was very biased towards my own thin privilege and
Mhm.
how scared I was of gaining weight. And
Mhm.
so since then, I've gained at least 30 pounds since I
Mhm.
stopped eating, stopped tracking what I ate, and stopped being obsessed with what I ate. And it has been a very tricky journey to allow myself the freedom to gain weight, to eat the foods that I want to eat. And it's not something that I would say I'm fully healed from as far as
Mm.
the body image issues, but it's
Yeah.
something that now is a scar and not a wound. It is not
Okay.
a deep festering wound where I can't talk about it or I can't become aware of it. It's a
Hmm.
scar that I know is there.
Hmm.
Sometimes it's a little itchy, and
Yeah.
I'm like, oh, there's that eating disorder wound, there's that body image
Okay.
wound. But I do think that microdosing helped that too, because it allowed me the presence to begin to appreciate my body for what my body does.
Mm.
Connecting to divine feminine energy has also really helped with that. Connecting to pleasure has helped with that. But now I am working on finding a nice little balance between how can I be very mindful of what I do put into my body. I had several years of teenage angst in my late 30s where I was like, I'm going to eat it all
Yeah. Yeah.
because I hadn't allowed myself ever. And so
Yeah.
now we're coming back into that. The pendulum swung one way and now we're getting
Yeah.
back to balance.
Yeah. I gotta find that happy medium for all of
Yeah.
that. Oh man. So yeah, I could go on and on about diet culture. That's probably another podcast we should. I've been very fortunate also with good genetics in that regard. I can't really dog on people too much for that because I've never really had to fight it too much. So I'm grateful for that. But I do think that a lot of the times it's pretty simple of what to eat and what not to eat, and then do some exercise and you'll be healthy. And it's very easy to slip into the extremes of all of it.
Yeah, sure. And I think for me, it was very much about, again, that feeling of unworthiness. I need to look perfect. I need to be the perfect size. I need to be hot. I need to be successful. I need to make a lot of money
Mm,
because that is how I will get love.
yeah. Oh,
And I think that honestly, it's all linked to those
yeah.
really deep wounds of unworthiness and this feeling of abandonment that I had. I'm adopted. So that
Okay.
throws in another little
Yeah.
extra layer of abandonment issue. So, yeah, I think for me, the diet culture plus the purity culture of the early 2000s, late
Mm,
1990s, plus being a preacher's daughter, it really is all in that sticky web.
yeah, for sure. For sure. So you mentioned that you went and did some therapy and you got on some meds that you didn't like the side effects. So what initially prompted you to start looking into the microdosing?
So, what's so funny, and I love to remind this man of this, my former news director years ago, gosh, it must have been like 19 or it probably wasn't in 2020 yet. It's probably 2019, pre-pandemic when life was like so different.
Yes.
Um, I used to do this weekly segment called Your Best Life for my TV station. And he was like, you know what? You should look into microdosing. And I did a quick Google. I was like, this is illegal. How am I going to do that? And that's where the conversation stopped. Now, years later, I have started my own podcast. I've really been able to explore deeper parts of spirituality. I recreationally tried mushrooms for the first time. I'd never did any recreational psychedelics or honestly anything except cannabis until I was in my 30s.
Yeah.
So I hear on a podcast a woman talking about microdosing for sexual trauma and for sexual shame. Her name is Bijou Finney. Shout out Bijou. I immediately contacted her to be on my show because I was like, this is fascinating. I have to dive deeper. The second I hung up the call, I'm like, I need to hire you because you have convinced me that this could be the thing that pushes it over to the next level.
Yeah.
So that's how I became aware, right? It was a podcast interview, very much like this one. So if you're
Yeah.
listening to this podcast interview, that might be your sign. People talk a lot about like the signs, the call to work with this sacred medicine. My call came from a podcast, and your call might come from a podcast too. It might come from a book. It might come from one of the documentaries that are out there. I'd also
Yeah.
watched those. The Michael Pollan one, How to Change Your Mind, is on
I
Netflix.
watched
There's a
that
couple of other
one.
ones too.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's how I got introduced to microdosing. And I really love the fact that you weren't high. You're
Hmm.
not high, you're not drunk, you're not intoxicated. You're completely able to function just like you would any other day.
Hmm.
once you get your dose right.
Yeah, which
Sometimes,
takes some time.
sometimes you take a little accidentally too much.
Yeah, I've
And
done that.
yeah, so we all have, and I think it's a canon event. We all have to. It's
Luckily, with the
necessary.
microdosing, though, it's still, you can still function because you are doing small doses. It's
Right.
not like you're immediately gonna, ooh, I'm gonna microdose. I'm gonna take 2 grams of mushroom.
No.
You're definitely starting small, but it is interesting to see how your body reacts. And I do know when I was trying to figure mine out, there was one day, luckily it was a Saturday. I was at home and I had nothing to do, but I was like, whoo, I'm feeling this a little bit more than I thought I was supposed
Yeah.
to.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
continue, sorry.
No, that's perfect. I liked that it was a way to incorporate this into my life in a way that felt doable. The other thing I really liked is that it brought me a deeper connection to earth, a deeper connection to the divine feminine. I really see mushrooms as a divine feminine entity, a
Mm.
divine feminine being. At least it has a lot of similarities to that, and we can talk about that if you want. But it helped me reconnect to my feminine body. And at that point, honestly, like I was at the height of my burnout. I had been
Mm.
sick for weeks and I could not figure out why. I didn't have COVID. I was tested multiple times. I had a terrible upper respiratory infection that impacted my throat. And I was like, this, I talk on TV for a living. This is not okay.
Yeah.
Never once did it cross my mind that it was burnout. So I start working with my mushrooms and then all hell breaks loose, which sometimes it's apt to do. And we can dive
Yeah.
deeper into that too. But I think what's important for folks to know is I had done what Western medical models told me to do.
Yeah.
I had a therapist, I had a psychiatrist, I had been on Adderall, I had been on Xanax, I had been on antidepressants for portions of my late 20s and early 30s. And when problems started to reemerge for me, when I was burnt out from my job, I had not been on those pharmaceutical drugs for years, and I didn't want to do that again.
Mm.
And so through the research, I discovered that not only could microdosing help me with this sexual issue, these sexual traumas, and this sexual shame, but also it could help me with mental health. And so I had to do a lot of internal soul searching. I had to look at my own biases around what drugs were and what
Mm.
psychedelics were. And that was a lot. And ultimately, for me, even though there's a risk associated with this, the risk was worth it. And I certainly have reaped the rewards.
Yeah, it's pretty interesting. We didn't really, you mentioned a little bit of of getting the herpes right after you had sex for the first time. So, since this is something that's so heavily impacted your sexual trauma and your worthiness and stuff, can you talk a little bit about what you were feeling in regards to that?
Oh, God. So in January of 2025, will be 20 years with herpes.
Okay.
And I started to openly talk about it in January of 24, so at the
Okay.
19-year mark. And what I'll say is, a freshman in college, I was away from home for the first time. I had sex at the tail end of November, and the symptoms popped up like right at the beginning of January.
Mm.
And it was like everything I had been told as a kid in church immediately came true. Oh, if you have sex before you get married,
Oh.
something bad will happen,
Mm.
or you'll get pregnant. My biggest fear was accidentally getting pregnant.
Yeah.
And that's probably because of the ancestral trauma of my very young birth mother, who was 12 when
Mm.
she got pregnant.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and it was because of molestation. So it's
Mm.
there's a
Oh,
cellular
yeah.
trauma there.
Yeah.
So when herpes, when I was at the doctor, I was at the beach with a friend. She was a nursing student. I'm like, you have to look at this. I don't know what that is. We got to go to the doctor. Two probably hungover 18-year-olds go to the doctor, get the diagnosis. The shame, the
Mm.
dirtiness, the blanket of just utter desolation that was on me was just all consuming. Don't think I would have called what happened something that made me feel suicidal, but I certainly had fantasies about disappearing from my life.
Mm.
How could I withdraw from school, clear my bank account, cut off my phone, get a burner, and just bounce? Never have to see another person
Mm.
that knows me again. And that created a big schism between me and the fam, uh, me and myself. And so that I think really made the eating disorder much worse
Yeah.
because it was something I could control. And the
Yeah.
body now was even less safe. and
Yeah.
less trustworthy. And so what happened for me with herpes was it really made me pick some real fucking losers, because
Mm.
I was so lucky in my mind to be with this person.
Mm.
What happened, I got married really early. I married a dude in the military real early. Contract marriage is what it's known as. If you guys know anything about that.
I didn't know there was
And
a term for it, but I do know a lot of military people get married early. So.
yes, it was for the benefits.
Yeah.
And then we did fall in love, but then that ended in like incredibly wild way. And then in that year after my divorce, when my eating disorder was at my peak, I was probably the skinniest I'd ever been, drinking heavily every day. And then in the dating scene, I will say some interesting things happened around herpes because I had to disclose, I had to tell these new
Right.
partners. And whether it was because I had the privilege of being skinny and successful and by standards of society beautiful as well, I never had an issue. And they didn't give a shit. And maybe it's
Wow.
just because dudes don't sometimes care.
Yeah.
But I got this practice. And then I think that acceptance did, at least on a subconscious level, allow me to see, okay, this is not that big a deal.
Okay.
It's going to be okay. And then when I met my now husband, same thing. I had told him he had a cold sore. I should say, I'm pretty sure I got it from a cold sore because,
Really?
yeah,
I didn't know if that was the same
it's
strain or if you could get it
it's
that way.
you absolutely can get it that way. It happens much more often than you think. And
Okay.
so I had a blood test in my 20s that basically showed which of the two viruses, HSV1 or HSV2, was present in my system. And it was HSV1, which is the cold sore virus, but that
Oh,
absolutely can present in the genitals.
okay.
So he also has HSV1. He was totally cool with it. So I share this because it's like the sharing of that and the talking about it, the letting it out of the closet of shame allowed it to dissipate a little. But when I finally decided to go public with the herpes, I did it for a couple of reasons. And honestly, that it's already paid me back tenfold. The first
Okay.
was because I felt like it was important to honor that part of me that, again, I realized that this was the skeleton in the closet, the last skeleton. I'm like, fuck
Mm.
this. I'm just going to let her out. Because when you have a shame monster in your closet that
Mm.
continues to grow bigger and bigger, it will bust out of there, whether you like it or not, and come up for you in maybe the ways that you're acting with friends or your coping mechanisms like getting wasted. But sometimes when we let it out of the closet, it's really just a little mouse
Mm.
that we were scared of.
Yeah.
So when I talked about this in January publicly, I thought for sure that the guy was going to come out and be all mad, and I've never really heard from him. But there was a different guy who was very upset about it. Other than that, everybody's been totally chill. And
Nice.
I did it because I needed me.
Yeah.
I needed me when I was 18. If I had me instead of the lack of support that I did have,
Hmm.
who knows what my life would have been like? I
Yeah.
probably would have taken a completely different turn in career. Who can say? But
Yeah.
I knew I needed me. And I was like, if only one little girl sees this and feels like she's not alone, there we go. Multiple people have reached out to me
Mm.
who have just gotten diagnosed.
Wow.
And so this year I've been able to talk to them. And so that for me is the reason
Yeah.
that this happened. It's the
Mhm.
reason why I decided to talk publicly about it. And it's the reason I found mushrooms, because that's why I wanted to initially take them, was because I had such a hang up around receiving oral sex and receiving pleasure.
Mm.
Because I would have these thoughts in my head when I tried to relax. Oh, this is shameful or dirty, or like, you don't deserve
Oh,
this.
yeah.
And even in my very loving partnership. So that's why I initially went to mushrooms, and why what I initially asked them was to help me become open to receiving pleasure. They heard me say that and said, honey, you aren't open to receiving at all right now. You got to become open to receiving anything, and then we'll eventually give you
Mm.
pleasure. And
Okay.
first, we have to take everything away from you, and then we'll give you it all back. So
Yeah.
that's the herpes story.
Oh man, I applaud you for going public with that because it is such a hard thing and it's still very stigmatized, very shamed, very, I don't know. But I think if it's affecting that many people and people are just hiding from it, I think it helps for sure to come out with that. So thank you for doing that for all the
Sure.
people out there that could use that support. So let's go back to, went on a little tangent there, but back to the microdosing. So How did you figure out what dosages to use for yourself? And then can you walk us through what you ended up doing dose wise and how often? Because in my own research, there's so many different things on the internet.
Yeah.
And I know that every person is different and every person is going to require different amounts and different schedules and whatever. But I would love for you to just talk about what that journey was for you.
Absolutely. I DIY'd so much of my spiritual and healing journey. I knew I did not want to DIY this.
Okay.
So that's why I hired someone.
Right.
I was able to find my dose thanks to working with Bijou. And
And was that mostly a trial and error type thing, or did she have
so
some recommendations?
so how I work with clients now and what I tell people is
Yes.
it is going to be a bit of a trial and error.
Yeah.
Most people start at 100 milligrams,
Mhm.
or that's 0.1 gram.
Okay.
That's much, much less than anything that's going to make you trip. And that's a good beginner place for most folks.
Mhm.
Some people will need less,
Mhm.
but the majority of people are going to be perfect right at 100, or they'll go higher. The first thing you do is clear your schedule on the first couple days that you're going to microdose, and you try your dose and you
Mhm.
see what happens. Do you feel more focused? Do you feel more relaxed? Do you feel drunk? Do you feel itchy inside? Do you feel woozy? Do you feel irritated? All of these can be signs that the dose might not be quite right. And so then we go from there. If you feel nothing after a few days of that dose, go to 150 and then up to 200. My sweet range is usually 2 to 250 milligrams right now, depending on whether or not there's anything else with the psilocybin. There are other things that you can stack with it, but usually I like to do just a pure source dose.
Yeah.
Now, a way to tell what you might experience as far as your dose is to notice your sensitivity to caffeine
Oh,
and your
interesting.
sensitivity to light and sound. So, if you have a really high caffeine tolerance, there is a chance that you may have a higher tolerance to psilocybin as well. Still, you're going to start with 100,
Mhm.
and then you may find that you go up. I had someone who had an insanely high caffeine tolerance, was probably ingesting a little too much caffeine, honestly, and their microdose was between 500 and 700 milligrams.
Mm. Wow.
That's pretty high. So generally the dose that folks talk about, the range that is talked about, is anywhere between 100 and 500 milligrams. That's what's termed a micro dose. I also have people that are so sensitive to this that they're taking 25 milligrams,
Oh, wow.
50 milligrams. So there's a massive range, and it really does depend on how well you know your body, how well you're able to tap into the sensations that you might be feeling, the stress that you're under, the environment, your life, your alcohol consumption, your caffeine consumption, whether or not you're also ingesting cannabis. So there are a lot of different things that play into it. But if you're listening and you're someone who is a DIYer, that 100 milligram mark is generally where I have people start. The second thing is we don't do it every day.
Yeah, that was, yeah.
So I started on a 3-day a week microdose protocol. And the way that I have people start, especially in my group program, Mindful Microdosing, is start 3 times a week. That's easy to fit in your schedule for most folks, because you want to be able to spend at least an hour in sacred ritual with this medicine. Doesn't have to be meditation, doesn't have to be journaling, but something other than going about your everyday life.
Okay.
Sitting in front of the TV, doing your homework, or scrolling on screens, right? We want to take a sacred pause. 3 days a week, most folks can make that happen.
Mhm.
Then you can go up to 4 days a week. Up to 5 days a week is generally considered safe, but most protocols, honestly, I don't know a single protocol that says you can do more than 5 times a week. The
Okay.
reason for that, it's not you're going to get addicted to it,
Mhm.
but you might build your tolerance so that you'd eventually need more and more. And you also have more of a chance of becoming what we call psychologically dependent. And that's
Mhm.
this phenomena that humans get where it's like, oh, I ate the medicine, I ate the mushroom, I feel better now. I need the medicine, I need the mushroom to
Mm.
feel this way. So you want to make sure you take those days off where you can experience the afterglow, where you can experience the benefits and really integrate what's coming up for you. And honestly, those days are as important, if not more important, than the days when you're actually eating your microdose. So
Okay.
I worked with this coach for about 3.5 months. took a little bit of a break just because of some major things that had happened. Like two of my dogs died.
Mm-hmm.
And I think I rounded out our 7 sessions in about 3.5 months total. And then I took a big break. And then in 2023, in January, when I entered into my own psychedelic certification trainings, I guided myself through. So I microdosed and tuned with my menstrual cycle, which is a different ball game altogether.
That sounds
Um,
super interesting.
yeah, and I can talk about that. I developed a method for that. But that was about a 12-week, 10 to 12-week, very intentional,
Mm-hmm.
transformational protocol because my intention was I take my precious time and I didn't create I didn't create content, I didn't create a new class, I didn't create new coaching stuff. I just rested. And it
Okay.
coincided perfectly with winter, which
Nice.
is the time when we go inward. And I think that was when everything came online for me. That was so transformational. That's the beginning of when I was sober. It's as I entered into training, it's as I entered into these relationships with some amazing mentors. And really, I pinpoint so much up leveling to that really dedicated practice. Yeah, so
Interesting.
that's how I've done it. I've done it 3 days a week, and then I've done it as many as 5 days a week in tune with my cycle.
And I think it's interesting too, because it's not something you have to do for forever, right? A lot
Right.
of drugs and antidepressants and stuff like that, they say they want you on for forever and don't, because you become reliant on it in order to, and you don't feel different afterwards, where this coincides with healing your brain and
Yeah,
changing your way of thinking and a lot of other healing practices as well. And therefore, eventually you don't need it anymore, right? Is the goal.
100%. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So I have not stuck to a dedicated practice. Now I have microdosed here and there for a few weeks, but nothing like that 12-week protocol since because
Mm-hmm.
so many things shifted.
Mm-hmm.
Now, exactly what you just said, right? The pharmaceutical industry and the way that those drugs work are band-aids. They are
Mm-hmm.
never getting to the root of why you're feeling that way. That's why you need them forever because you're
Yeah.
bleeding out with a band-aid over it. And
Yeah.
if you take the band-aid off, you're going to be screwed.
Yeah.
So, mushrooms, I see them as these allies, these partners that come into your life for a cycle, can help you work through something that is maybe consciously or unconsciously impacting you. They'll give you what you need, not necessarily what you want. So don't be
Mm-hmm.
surprised if you ask for something and you get something else. See it as a lesson,
Mm-hmm.
surrender to the process. But that's really why I love them so much because, you know, unlike the pharmaceutical industry and even therapists, I work with people so that I don't have to work with you again.
Yeah.
Like we're working for a little bit of time. I set you up with all of the knowledge that you need to then go about your own life.
Mm-hmm.
Whether you want to microdose again in the future or not, you have the tools. And of course, if you want a check in, you can always come back to me. But I just wrapped with this wonderful client this past week, and I sold her in our last session. I was like, "You have all the tools you need. You have remembered things that you had forgotten, and now you have this beautiful relationship with this fungi ally that can nurture and nourish you in whatever ways you would like it to as you move forward."
Yeah.
So, yeah, that's my thought on when we need it and when we don't. There is this thing, now we've talked about microdosing, there is this thing around full doses that I see happening that's worrisome and tricky. And
Mm.
that's this idea, and I've seen it so many times people going from full dose journey to full dose journey to full dose journey.
Mm.
They're eating
Interesting.
mushrooms, they're going to ayahuasca, they're doing combo, they're doing more aya, they're going and eating more mushrooms, and they're having these big, expansive, hallucinatory trips where they probably feel deeply connected to source, deeply connected to themselves, and then they don't integrate. They
Mm.
lose that feeling after a few weeks, after the afterglow goes away of those big, expansive experiences, and they need that experience again. And so they do more psychedelics.
Mm.
That's not something that I see happening very often in microdosing,
Yeah.
but I always tell my clients if you go to 4 days a week, if you go to 5 days a week, watch yourself, especially if you have an addictive personality, watch yourself as you progress and make sure that you look out for that little tiny little voice in the back of your head that's I need this,
Mm.
the clinging. And If that happens, let's get curious about what's coming up. What is
Yeah.
that and where is it coming from? So that's certainly something that can happen. This feel like you need it. But I do see that happening with big doses more than small
That's
doses.
interesting. So for a microdose, talk about what that should or shouldn't feel like. Because I think people out there who are very unfamiliar with drugs and
Yeah.
are like, oh my God, this is just doing drugs. And I don't like that. And I don't like the sound of it. Should you be feeling anything? Or how does that, when you take the microdose, what should that look like for you?
So there was this term that the big heavy hitters in microdosing use. It's called subperceptual. I don't use it. I don't think that's true. I think that you can perceive the shifts in the body when you're tuned in. That's why I pair microdosing with somatic work. That's what I do. I'm a somatic microdosing guide. Things you might experience. You might feel calmer. You might feel like you've had a glass of wine. You might feel more alert. You might feel like you've had a cup of coffee. You might feel tired. You might feel energized. It's tricky. You could, the
Yeah.
pendulum swings both ways.
Okay.
And it really depends on a few things. It can depend on something like strain, which we don't need to get into, but the strain that you're using can have some of those impacts. But generally, what I've noticed is it might be related to your intention,
Mm-hmm.
the time of day, your overall stress, your overall habits and routines. And so I'm usually a morning microdoser. Most people that I work with are. I've also had some folks have a lot of success with evening microdosing. The thing that I have found to be the most tricky is when microdosing makes you feel really alert, it can be a little difficult to do it at night, right? Because it can
Yeah.
impact your sleep. Flip side, if it makes you tired and you're a morning microdoser, that can be tricky. So you're going to learn what's best for you. You're going to understand what it feels like in your body after a week or two. What I'll say is if it gets to where you feel drunk, like drunk, woozy, I call it spiciness in the body. It's this feeling that I get in my chest when my dose is too high.
Mm-hmm.
Like it's a little anxiety, but it's just this, it's not necessarily racing heart, but it's like an internal itchiness. But generally, especially when we're doing practices and rituals like the ones that I guide clients through, you're going to feel more tuned in. You're going to feel this ability, especially after several weeks, of almost this ability to zoom out on life and look down and pick apart and put together the little pieces, like connect the dots. And other like benefits and things people have told me that they've experienced, patience, especially with kids.
Mm.
That for my moms out there is like the number one thing. I am patient with my child. I am tapped into my inner child. I want to play with them. They're not making me feel overstimulated.
Yeah.
People who are entrepreneurs that I work with, I'm able to focus on work life balance. I'm able to say, okay, this is the boundary. And I've worked with a lot of folks around grief, which can be something that's hard, very hard to manage because of the way society just doesn't allow us to grieve properly. We don't know how to
Yeah.
do that. But what microdosing gives those folks is this open heartedness,
Mm.
an ability to see maybe more like silver lining, if you want to say it, but perception of connectivity, of oneness, even when the person might not be here anymore.
Mm.
It can also increase your spiritual connection, whatever your belief system is. And this is beyond really the whole discussion around rewiring the brain and creating more neuroplasticity and softening the default mode network where things like your anxiety live and your unworthiness live. So, those
Mm.
are things you might feel and things you might experience. What did you feel?
I didn't feel a lot. I guess I definitely felt the patience. I definitely felt the more relaxed. It didn't make me like I was on caffeine at all. It was definitely, I was a morning microdoser. I definitely wish though I would have had the tidbit to like take that time right after you take it because I would take it in the morning, do my normal morning routine of exercise, get ready for work, go to work. But to take that time, I think would have been a good tidbit to have before. So thank you for that. But yeah, I think I just felt more relaxed and chill. And it did help me on hard days at work and stuff like that, process things a little bit better. But yeah, I wanted to do it longer. I did it for gosh, probably 6 to 8 weeks or something like that over this past summer. And then I was getting ready to go on a long vacation in a different country. And I was like, well, I'm not going to bring these with me. So that's how I stopped, but I still have some of them in my cabinet. My husband's, what are you doing with these now? I'm like, I don't know, maybe I'll do it still from time to time. So I don't think I just did the normal internet research. I was like, okay, I'll start with this dose. I did have that one time where I was like, this is maybe too much. And I just felt like maybe that's when I felt more the like jittery, like energy, harder to focus situation. I definitely felt that. And then, but other than that, I think it's really great for people. I really do. And I wish that we would look into it a little bit more. And I'm glad that it's coming to the forefront because I do think we need a different option from just antidepressants.
Yeah.
I actually had a brother of a good friend who was severely depressed and actually almost suicidal. And he was in therapy, on antidepressants, on all the things. And he actually started microdosing mushrooms and LSD, which is a whole other thing. I haven't met anybody that's talked about that yet, but he had to do it all on his own. He had to figure out how to do it all on his own. And he even asked his therapist, he said, I asked, I want to try this. Can you help me? And the therapist was like, no, I can't because it's all illegal.
Right.
And I don't want to get in trouble.
Right.
And so he had to do it all on his own and figure it all out on his own. And I think that's so overwhelming. And then because it's illegal drug stuff, I don't know how he got the information on microdosing LSD. I'm sure it's out there, but like on the internet, probably not as much information. But he was infinitely better after doing that and doing that program that he did. And I just think it has so much more benefits than our pharmaceutical drugs do.
Yeah, same. Oh my God, for sure. I think that, yeah, I really think that well, we can get into the conspiracy theories, but I really think that the reason why they're illegal is not because we have a quote loving government that cares whether or not you're going to fall off your roof when you're high. It's because when you begin to expand your consciousness and heal your shit, you start to understand that we are all connected and that we don't want to go to war. We don't really care about capitalism. We don't really give a shit about the economy. We're not individualistic. We're more community based and collective based. And I think that's probably the master plan of the mushrooms. The mycelium network runs underneath everything in our soil. It's what made our soil so fertile when the dawn of time happened. Like they are the mother of our planet as we know it. They are the ones who made it fertile. Yeah. And I really do think that, these like funky little aliens like want us to take care of ourselves so that we take care of our community, the collective, and the planet. That does not jive with the powers that be. And so that's partly why I had to do a lot of that soul searching. Or what is right? What is wrong? Am I okay in the gray area? Because I am not naturally someone who's like that. For my whole life has been very much, this is right, this is wrong. Like it's in my chart. It's in all the places. Like it's just a core part of myself. And I had to look and like, okay, the law of man versus the law of nature. And which one feels like it's more important and beneficial for me. I got to be here supporting those folks who want to go possibly against what the law are like and take that risk. And for me, it worked. And I'm not going to sit here and say that you should take the risk. This is your choice. You have the choice and you have to be aware of that. And it's tricky. But I hate that he had to figure it all out on his own. And that's, I think, why I've been on like 60 something podcasts this year, just because I want to be a resource for people so that you don't have to do it alone. Like I was a cheerleader in high school and that's what I do now. I like cheer people on
Love that.
help them figure out their shit. And then we let them go and you, with lights ignited within themselves. So yeah.
Yeah, it's so hard we're so conditioned with so many things in society. Even just talking about your definition of success in your mind, like the definition of society's success is burn yourself out, work like a crazy person, make loads of money, and then what?
Die.
And I think more and more of the younger generations coming up are changing that for sure. But I'm a hairdresser and I'm in a community of a whole bunch of other hairdressers that run their own businesses. And I frequently ask everybody and myself, what is your definition of success? Because it doesn't have to be working 7 days a week, 12 hours a day, making $200,000-$300,000 in that time. Like
it doesn't have to be that. It could be as simple as just being a good mom
Yeah.
or like it or traveling. Maybe that's what you want to do. Like it doesn't have to be what society has told us, but I think it's so hard to break those social norms in your brain.
What will help? Mushrooms.
Mushrooms. I love that. Okay, I want to talk really quick. I have a couple more questions for you. I would love for you to elaborate a little bit more, if you can, on microdosing with your cycle. I think that sounds so fascinating. If you're willing to chat about
For
that for a
sure. Yeah. So when I started my coaching business, I was a menstrual cycle coach and a menstrual cycle educator
Oh, okay.
because I had been so disconnected from the womb. I had this sexual shame. I was on birth control for 16 years. And so when I came off of it, all hell broke loose. I really had
Mm,
to do a lot of work around relearning my cycle. I had
yeah,
never,
you never learned it.
never learned it.
They
My,
love to put us on
yeah.
birth control when we're teenagers and have cramps. That was my
Well,
story.
like I said before, my biggest fear was getting pregnant
Yeah,
accidentally.
yeah,
So you bet your ass I got on birth control before any of that
yeah,
happened.
yeah.
And my mom, my adoptive mom, had a hysterectomy before I was born. So I was never around a bleeding person.
Mm,
Anyway, so I really understood viscerally how much the cycle impacts every single aspect of our life.
yes.
And yeah, there might not be time to get into all of that, but just so that your menstrual cycle is not just when you have your period, it is
Mhm.
the first day of your period, all the way until the day before your next period. And so within those weeks, you've got 4 distinct phases where your mood fluctuates, your metabolism fluctuates, your brain capacity to focus all shifts. So when I started to microdose and I was sticking to this 3 day a week plan and then looking at all of the protocols created by men, I was like, okay,
Mm,
if the cycle impacts every aspect of my life, then it's going to impact my microdosing. And
yeah.
then microdosing would also impact my cycle. So there's been like 2 studies on how psilocybin impacts menstrual cycles. One of them, which was a very broad study of 3 people, yeah, basically showed that full dose journeys can bring your period back, make it more regular. And then microdosing afterwards for one of the people who had PMDD, which is premenstrual dysphoric
Yep.
disorder, PMS on crack, it helped her deal with her symptoms. Not that it necessarily lessened the symptoms, although she said that it was probably a little less, but her ability to handle the challenges
Mm,
astronomically higher. I'm like, oh, this is fascinating. So I developed a plan where you take your cycle, you split it in half. Usually you've got 2 weeks where you feel good, and you usually have 2 weeks where you might not feel that great. So, in the 2 weeks where you're feeling great, which is usually inner spring and inner summer, right after your period stops, that energy rises, you're feeling like a bad bitch, everything in life is going great, you would microdose about twice a week. You could do 3 times a week, but I usually say 1 day on, 2 days off, repeat. After ovulation, when you notice that your energy starts to go down a little, you might also see issues like bloating or acne or mood swings, any of those cyclical challenges that you know you have. You would then shift to microdosing 5 times a week.
okay.
So, 5 times a week for 2 weeks, right? Overall, that means in a cycle that's 28 days, let's say that's your cycle, you'd microdose 14 of those days, roughly half, right? So, a perfect amount for most people. And what it does is it backfills the amount of time you're with the medicine into the weeks where you need the most support,
Yeah.
and then allows you the freedom to spend time away from medicine when you have the most energy and when you're naturally able to learn new things, so you can look back at the things that came up for you during your um, more microdosing days. The other thing that's really fascinating, and some folks, even my former coach and my former guide, she doesn't like to microdose on her period. I am obsessed with that shit.
Okay.
I will microdose on my period till the day I don't have a period. And I pray that does not come anytime soon, even though I am in perimenopause.
Oh shit.
When you're on your period, the veil thins, the literal physiological veil, the line between the right and left hemispheres of your brain thins. So you're
Jeez.
actually able to communicate between those 2 spaces a little bit
Mm.
easier. It's generally why you might have crazy dreams on your period. What I like to do is eat a little bit of mushrooms and then do a visioning journey or a deep meditation or paint or draw or do something that really feels like a more broad, dedicated ritual and see what comes up. I have named coaching courses. I have created new things. I flushed out all the details for the cyclical microdosing method, which is what we're talking about,
Mhm.
because I was microdosing while I bled. And so that's generally it. If you want to learn more, I have a free 5-day mini course. It gets sent straight to your email. I can give you that for show notes if you want. And
Yeah.
it's not only going to teach you how to microdose, but also how to track your cycle if you
Mhm.
don't know how to do that. And it'll give you ways to integrate, how to troubleshoot, because there will be probably a little bit of troubles, and that's okay. And then a deep look at what integration looks like. So I'm happy to hand that out to you to put into your show notes. But
Yeah.
that's
Yeah.
generally the gist of it. And
Okay.
and what I'll say is every single client I have worked with has had fewer cramps after working
Oh,
together.
okay.
Some as much as 50% less.
Okay.
Now I don't put that in marketing because
Yeah.
I can't guarantee, but
Sure.
every single one. The client I just wrapped with was diagnosed with endometriosis while we worked together.
Mm,
And she messaged me. She would have a lot of mid-cycle, so around ovulation pain. And she was on this trip and she was whatever. She messaged me. She's like, I woke up, I had cramps on microdose. They were gone in 2 hours.
oh,
That is likely because there are some studies that show mushrooms might be anti-inflammatory.
okay.
And so physiologically, I think that's why that happens. Again, I think that when we rewire the brain and we give ourselves more permission to soften into symptoms, sometimes symptoms go away. I used to see working with people when it was just on the menstrual cycle, no mushrooms included, cramps go down too, because sometimes pain in the body is a warning sign and a call for attention.
Mm,
And so when you begin to live more intentionally, putting your awareness and your attention on that thing, sometimes it dissipates. And I
mm,
think that's also partly what's happening when I'm seeing such a decrease in pain around the cycle with these clients. The other thing is that their moods are extremely elevated all
mm.
cycle long. And again, you're having fewer mood swings in that couple of day period before the actual period. So I've been incredibly surprised and pleasantly surprised at this basically citizen scientist based
Yeah.
survey that we're running with these clients. But yeah, the cyclical microdosing method. And I will say this too, if you're listening and you do not bleed, you can also microdose cyclically. You would just microdose with the moon. And in the 5-day mini course,
Oh,
it also tells you how to do that. So if you're
okay.
postpartum, if you're past your bleeding years, if you're in perimenopause and you don't have a regular cycle, or you have a hormonal challenge that means that you don't have a regular cycle either, like PCOS,
Hmm.
you will find out how to cyclically microdose even without a bleed.
That's so interesting. So is that something that you would only do for a temporary amount of time, or is that something you would continue
I usually
for
say
some
three
time?
I usually say 3 menstrual cycles and
Okay.
then take one full cycle off and see what's happening. You know,
Okay.
the 3 cycle model is the norm for any work around the menstrual cycle, and that's because of a few things, some related to egg development, but also just because it often takes us several months to put practices into place
Yeah.
that are going to the lifestyle changes, the diet changes. And what's interesting, and I'll say this as someone who healed her eating disorders and all kinds of stuff thanks to microdosing, there is something really special that can happen with the mushrooms when they start to tell you, here's how we balance. Here's how we, I guess what I'm trying to say is mushrooms want you to be in balance and they will point out to you where you're not.
Mm-hmm.
And so that could look like your relationships, your food, the things that you're doing physically, the job. And they will do things to wipe away
Mm-hmm.
that. So I share that because part of what is necessary for a lot of people to see changes in the cycle is a change in what they're eating. And so I think that mushrooms naturally support those changes in
Okay.
really beautiful ways, spiritually and also with the rewiring and reprogramming of the brain.
Yeah. Wow. I love this. This is so much good information. Okay. So my next thing that I want to touch on before I let you go is explain to my listeners who maybe don't know what the somatic part of your coaching is.
Yeah. So somatics, very basically, is really just having to do with the whole self, the whole organism, mind, body, soul, spirit. The way that I work with somatics is helping people reconnect their mind body connection.
Mm.
So many of us, especially ADHD babes like myself, who also are blessed with anxiety, we are always up in our heads. That's where we live. And we think that's where our emotions come from, where our thoughts and beliefs come from. But in reality, a lot of that, 80% in fact, is happening in the body.
Mm.
Your sensations are where the language begins. Your body is where the language begins. Your brain makes the language into something you understand.
Mm-hmm.
So think about if you're someone who's ever had a panic attack, you likely started to notice physical sensations
Mm-hmm.
that led you to believe, oh, this is panic. Oh, this is anxiety. So with somatic work, what I help people understand and learn to do is relearn what those sensations feel like, what they look like, relearn how to feel safe in the body by regulating the nervous system. And we do that through things like breath work, through things like movement. I led a class this morning about boundaries for my membership, and we did a lot of different movements about boundaries and helping them viscerally feel the yes and the no.
Mm.
And so somatic work and how it plays so perfectly into microdosing is that both of these things help to heal the mind body connection so we can come back into wholeness.
Mm.
When we pair somatic practices with our microdosing days through things like my shift method, which is a 9-minute daily practice that's 2 minutes of journaling, 3 minutes of breath work, 4 minutes of movement,
Mm.
we're able to snap out of it, right? If we're in a funk, if we're in a worry, if we're in like a spiral, to snap out of the mind, come back into the body, start to notice what those sensations are showing us. And as we show our body and our brain that this is how we're going to operate now, the microdosing, as it starts to rewire those neural pathways, relearns the path. Oh,
Mm.
okay. Instead of going into a complete shame spiral over this, that, or the other, now we're going to breathe through it. We're going to sense the self. We're going to notice where we're feeling sensations. We're going to notice what stories are coming up. And we're
Mm.
going to find a tool from our toolbox, be it breath or movement or grounding or cold plunging or whatever, to help us navigate that. And now, the next time it happens, and the next time it happens, when we repeat that process and we have these continued actionable steps, that's what helps the brain relearn. And so that's how the somatic portion comes. The other way the somatic portion and the way that I work with people really is beneficial is because I work with women and we are so disconnected from our bodies. It's
Mm.
because of diet culture.
Mm.
It's because of our patriarchal society. It's because of possibly religious programming. The flesh is sinful. I can't admit that I want this, that, or the other. And so I think what I've noticed is that with women specifically, when we can find a way to befriend our body and a way to come home to the body, it empowers us to live a life that feels really juicy and really exciting
Mm.
because we know that at our core, we've got our back. We're
Yeah.
not at odds with this relationship that's the longest and most important relationship you will ever have is with yourself.
Mm.
And so if you're hating your body, if you're only living from the neck up, what kind of relationship is that?
Yeah.
So that helps it come back online too. The
Mm.
somatics and the psychedelics are like gold for healing.
Mm.
Honestly, like I think it is the most underrated healing combination out there. And the best part is you can start working with your soma. You can start working with somatics right now. You don't have to eat any mushrooms to experience really amazing transformation.
Yeah.
And it can be just as simple as like taking a moment and just begin to notice the sensations in your body. Name them out loud. I think a lot of us think, oh, I feel fine.
Mm-hmm.
I feel fine. I don't really feel that much. Okay. And that's totally normal and totally understandable based on the way we live. Right.
Yeah.
And so I think that for me, especially, breath work, chef's kiss. Thank goddess for breath work. That is such an easy, free entry point to getting into this. I have a YouTube page with tons of free practices. And so if you're looking for something, if you know that what you're doing right now just doesn't feel like it, this is probably airing in the beginning of 2025. If this is your year to get your mental health on check or to just make your life something that feels good. So many people come to me like, I don't really know what's wrong, but I just don't feel good. I feel blah.
Yeah.
I would say start with somatics in the form of breath work. It's the easiest to access. It's easy to find a YouTube video. I can give you the ebook for the shift method too and put that in the show notes. I don't like to gatekeep anything. Like, here's all this stuff. Let me know if you need help. Go for it. But I really think that for me, coming back home to my body after all of the trauma, after the eating disorder trauma, the birth trauma, the alcoholism, the sexual shame, has been the reason I've been put on this planet. And somatics and psychedelics are what got me here. And I know continue to be, unless I find something else interesting and cool, will continue to be what will guide me, I think, through the rest of my life.
Yeah. I love that. Thank you so much. So working with you, we've touched a little bit on what things you offer. Give me a little overview of if people want to reach out and work with you. I'm going to link everything in the show notes too, every way to get a hold of you. But is it one-on-ones? Is it group stuff? Give me the whole.
For sure. If you're listening to this and you are sick and tired of just feeling like you're not in control of your life, you feel like you want better mental health, you want a better connection to your body, maybe you're struggling with eating disorders or you're drinking more than you would like, I would love to invite you to just book a free one-on-one call with me. We can discuss all of the options. I do one-on-one coaching. Okay. And I have a 30-day group program called Mindful Microdosing. We have a January cohort, and I know run it multiple times in 2025, but the dates are not in my head yet.
Yeah, sure.
I just ran the first cohort in October. There were 7 women in it. And it was amazing. It's a very deeply check-in every day, live calls once a week. We foster a community with like-minded women where you're also guided by me to learn to microdose, to learn to do it in a way that feels safe for your nervous system, to build a toolbox of practices so that you can continue to microdose on your own. And then I also have a membership that right now is only open to clients or former clients, but I'll probably open it eventually to everybody else. So one-on-one or group, those are the main 2 ways. And then I have lots of free stuff. I have my podcast. I have my YouTube page. You can find me on Instagram at Leslie Draffin. But honestly, this is your birthright. To know yourself and to befriend your body and to be at home with your body is your birthright. And unfortunately, we don't live in a world where we ever hear that. And so if you're feeling lost, if you're feeling stuck, somatic work, psychedelic work might be a wonderful tool for you. Cyclical living, another wonderful tool. And so if those jive with you and you want to learn more, I hope we meet each other. Hope you reach out.
Yeah. I love that. And again, everything will be in the show notes. So anybody listening and you want to get a hold of Leslie, go check out the show notes for all the links, or you can reach out to me and I can always send them too. Do you have whatever you just ended on was lovely, but do you have any final parting words, advice, anything you want to share before we go?
Let me think. I think that for me, I will say the thing I needed to hear when I started my healing journey is you can do less. You can do less. You talked about what is your idea of success, doing as little as possible and loving life as much as possible.
Yes.
And if you're someone who feels stressed, if you just had the most stressful holiday season, if you're entering into 2025 where you feel like anxiety and overwhelm are just like these 2 assholes that will never leave you alone, then could you do a little less? And what would that look like for you?
Yeah. Love that. Thank you so much, Leslie. I think this conversation has been so helpful and so informative. And thank you so much for sharing all of your personal journey too. I know that's not an easy thing for everyone. So I appreciate you being open and vulnerable about all of that as well. And I hope everybody out there maybe starts to discover their own psilocybin journey.
Yeah, me too. Thanks for having me, Tawny.
Yeah, thanks. All right, everybody. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you on the next episode.
Thank you so much for tuning into today's episode. If you enjoyed our conversation and found value in the stories shared, please consider following us on your preferred podcast platform. Your ratings and reviews make a huge difference. They help us reach more listeners and continue bringing you engaging, insightful content. We appreciate your support and would love to hear your thoughts and feedback. Until next time, keep listening, growing, and sharing.